Hi, I'm James and welcome to another review. Today we're looking at modern crisis scenarios for Matrix Wargaming. Now if you've not come across Matrix Wargaming, don't worry, I'm going to explain what that is. Now the book's by John Curry and Tim Price MB. Now John Curry's been heavily involved in the History of Wargaming project, publishing a lot of reprints of various classic books, a lot of the Donald Featherstone ones for example. Now I picked this one up, it was very, very cheap on Amazon. Bizarrely, the paperback was actually cheaper than the Kindle version. Picked up a lot of the Kindle versions of things, but I just thought, at this price, I think it was about £3. What do I lose? Now let's have a look through the book. It's a 128-page book, two of which are at the end are blank. Nicely illustrated. It's got a lot of nice maps and a few photos, all of it in colour. Now it starts off by giving a nice foreword. Now it explains that these Matrix games are really based on the professional level wargaming. So the sort played by military commanders and so on, to actually go through scenarios before they happen, which is quite an interesting thing to be looking at, and something that I've not really looked at before. Now it starts off with an advice chapter, practical advice on Matrix games. Now the way a Matrix game works is you have a team of players sat around the table, and each team presents usually one argument per turn. So what they have to do is give what has happened, why or what effect it's going to have, and reasons to support it. So for example, in a 1982 Falklands conflict game, it would be perfectly reasonable for the British player to argue that he has achieved air superiority because the Harriers he has are flying locally. They're not having to make long distance flights. They are using tactics that are unfamiliar to the Argentines because they're using vectored thrust. They have later issue air-to-air missiles, because they have the later model Sidewinder supplied by the Americans, which would have to be an argument they'd have got previously, and the superior quality of the pilots. That argument is made. Now, depending on the set of rules, these then suggest that counter arguments can be used. So the Argentine player might argue that while they are flying a distance, they will actually have a better chance of success because they have more aircraft. So both sides put their arguments together, and these are then judged, and it gives various methods to adjudicate this. The simplest one being 6-sided dice. You roll 2, needing 7 or more to succeed in your argument, but modified by the arguments that both sides have made. For example, each positive one might give a +1, each negative might give a -1. It does give a nice example that you shouldn't be exceeding the bounds of reality. Unarmed protesters are unlikely to beat police. It does give some examples then of arguments that could be used to actually help counter that. So it explains what Matrix games are, gives a fair bit of advice if you've never run one of these before. So there's a number of things you can do in an argument, actually assessing it, gives a probability curve for 2 6-sided dice, talks about also using just terminology like highly likely, likely, maybe, unlikely and highly unlikely, and then percentages based on that. It talks about making reasonable assumptions, turn length, game length, the end of turn consequence management. So because of what you've done, what happens. It then talks about inter-turn negotiations, elections, secret arguments, things are going off sort of behind the scenes, all manner of things there. Advice on how many players you should have, how to actually write the briefs for them, advice on record the results so you've got them for future use, starting conditions, simple advice on if you do have large scale combat, uses the Scrud, for those who've come across it before. Simple combat resolution using dice, where you just roll dice and match them up. So it talks about that. It talks about what to do if there's division within a group. All manner of things there. Talks about, gives a few words of warning and some final comments. So it's quite a good little guide if you've never run one before. It's pretty simple. We then have a matrix game checklist, what you would need for each game, and it gives a few sort of, as it says, short checklists of things that you might need to have. You then come into the meat of the book, which are the scenarios. So the first scenario is Baltic Challenge, which is NATO-Russian posturing in the Baltic Sea. Very interesting little scenario, because it's unlikely to go to a full-scale war. Most of these aren't going to result in a full-scale war, but they can result in skirmishing, and it's good for the political background from a gamer's perspective. So you have the Russian deployment of nuclear-capable missiles in Kaliningrad, and it goes through the background. This is excellent if you want a scenario or two for a war game, modern day, and it gives you the fact file about Kaliningrad, talks about the different types of Russian missiles. And then you have a full A4 page brief for each of the players. In this game you have Russian dissident groups in the Baltics, the Baltic states, you have Poland, you have the Nordic states, in other words Sweden and Finland, NATO other than the USA, and the USA. And it then gives a one-page after-action report from when this was run professionally, sort of giving some of the information as to what actually happened when they ran it. Very interesting as a background, and a nice little scenario. The next one, so into chapter 4, is the Mare Nostrum, which is again Russian NATO posturing, but this time in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. So it gives the significance of the Black Sea. You then get into the countries, which are the USA, Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, Cyprus and Great Britain. And you're talking, to give you an idea, 2 to 4 week turns for this. There's also, in this one very usefully, a summary of the Montreux Convention on the regime of the Straits, which goes to about a page and a half, a map, and a half-page after-action report. So, again, another good one. The 9-line incidents in the South China Sea. So this one is looking at particularly Chinese claims of its territorial waters, which is where the 9-line comes from. It talks about all the different people who have claims in all the different parts of the South China Sea. A useful paragraph on why are they worth arguing over. That's a nice inclusion. Gives a list of some of the recent flashpoints that have occurred, what has gone off historically, and then you get into the again 6 briefings. Again, full page briefing for each team, giving all the information that they need. A whole page for game facilitator notes on this one, and some random event cards which are designed to be chucked in to see what happens. So, for example, you have a mineral discovery. Information is leaked about a significant discovery of adamantium, valuable and rare mineral used in the production of high-end computing devices and medical technologies. The information is rumoured to have come from a state survey vessel with strict orders to keep it and the precise location secret. And the effect is a successful argument is required to determine the location. So straight away that's going to change the dynamics of the game. You've got other ones for fishing disputes. A multi-storey government building in South Africa being destroyed by a plane crashing into it. There's speculation it was caused by a maintenance failure, but some believe it was terrorism. And essentially there the effect is none, unless determined as a result of successful arguments. So these are things going on in the wider world. There's 12 of those. Multiple maps for that. Nice list of occupied features within the Spratly Islands region, listing which ones have got airfields and who owns what. Again, we've got an after action report about a page long, so there's a lot of good detail for that. For a naval gamer, that would set up your scenarios beautifully. You've then got election. Now, it's a bit of a strange one, this, because I wouldn't have said it was a war game. It's a fictional country which looks remarkably American, where you have the various the two main political parties vying for power in election year, but you have different wings within the party. This one actually has 7 players. You've got the Liberal Party candidate, Conservative Party candidate. You've got 2 alternative candidates who've lost the nomination, but obviously are then trying to keep within the party, but there are odds with the candidates. You've got 2 factions of media, one of which supporting each side, and I particularly like the fact you then have the 7th one, Vladimir Putin, whose objectives are punish the country for decades of anti-Russian policies and secure the best election result for Mother Russia. Yeah, quite a sort of a cynical one with this. It has some nice touches where you have the different policies, you have groupings of states, some of which will probably vote for you anyway, other ones of which you have to swing. So nicely put together. Probably give a very good insight onto the American election process. You then have the next game, which is Conflict on the Korean Peninsula. It's very interesting that actually most of players' objectives during this are to not actually have a conflict. But there's a huge amount of detail looking at missile ranges, world's nuclear arsenal, what the ranges are of the different Korean missiles, what strategic locations you have in North Korea. Again, if you were using this to write a Korean war game, this would give you a lot of good background. Players quite interesting: America, North Korea, Japan, China, South Korea and Russia. So there's plenty of options there for where things are going to go. Again, as ever, 1-page briefings for them and an after action report. So again, a really interesting one, and it does give you insight into why the different countries want North Korea not to fail. It's very interesting that everybody has a bit of a stake in keeping North Korea stable. Not necessarily going to be the best outcome for them, but most people will agree that keeping it stable is probably their best bet. And then another one, which is a slightly odd one, I'm confused why it was in Modern Matrix, which is De Valera's War, all about Irish neutrality in the Second World War. Again, fascinating bit with that. If you're going to game a war game set around 1940, you've got full breakdowns of what forces both sides have, where they were, a full breakdown of what the Irish Air Force is, which is quite useful, lists the British units in Northern Ireland, and interestingly the Americans actually have 7 divisions available. Sorry, my apologies, six divisions and elements of the 8th Air Force, which does make it quite interesting. Again, this is a 7-player game. You've got De Valera, who's the Taoiseach of the Republic. You've got the Chief of Staff for the IRA, Sean Russell. Sir Basil Brooke MC, who's the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the German Abwehr. So the German intelligence agencies are involved. Winston Churchill, assisted by his press attaché. The David Bruce, who's the head of the OSS in Europe, and it gives an American touch to it. And Archbishop John Kincaid, the Roman Catholic Primate of all Ireland. Interesting cast of characters, and everybody's got things that they want to achieve. The big one being keeping in or out of the war, but you also have the 3 Irish treaty ports that the British are desperate to get their hands on. And I like the fact that there are occasionally lovely little touches. I'm just looking for the one I found earlier, which I thought was quite interesting, which is for John Betjeman, the press attaché. This is John Betjeman, the poet. He actually has two of his objectives are remain alive and well, and use your spare time to write great poetry about your time in Ireland. Lovely little touch. So you have that, and some background reading with it. You've then got some sample counter sheets, which it notes are available online. If they're available online, I'm not quite sure why we need them in here, particularly since they would have to be copied because they're being double-sided. And the different sides don't seem to be for the same similar background. But yeah, I suppose it filled a few pages. Very interesting book. Like I say, I only paid a few pounds for it, with the aim actually of getting some background for some modern gaming. But I'm actually quite interested in the scenarios. They are actually quite interesting, and I'm going to look forward to playing a few of these out. Whether it appeals to you is probably another thing. If you like Matrix games, you've got 6 ready written ones here, covering a nice variety. So, useful little book, and in my eyes, well worth the money.